And for more on this story, I'm joined by Isabelle Trick, an associate director at the Global Counsel. Thanks for being with us here on France 24. Good to see you again. So what kind of support is there in the region for a military intervention in Niger? And if it does happen, who would pay for it? Who would finance it?
This is probably the big question, the question of finance. But let's first talk about support. The African Union has been meeting about the situation in Niger on Monday, and since then, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union has been very divided, and it looks like they are going to come out against military intervention. That is, of course, not at all what ECOWAS wanted to hear, who actively called for the African Union to support them. That, of course, then raises the question again about finance. And the African Union decision to possibly not support is an interesting opportunity to touch on something that's happened within the European Union. Because from 2004 to 2021, the European Union had the African Peace Facility, which was a vessel through which the European Union channeled about 2.7 billion euros to peace operations in Africa. And there was the question of whether the European Union could be called upon to help support this intervention, this potential intervention financially, especially because the dire situation that many ECOWAS members are in. And in 2021, the European Union changed its framework. Up until 2021, all the money for African peace operations had to go through the African Union. Whereas since 2021, money could now potentially go directly to partner countries or to regional blocs like ECOWAS. So the framework would potentially be in place that even if there is African Union opposition for the EU to support a military intervention. But of course, whether they would do is not just a question of frameworks being in place, but also of how politically palatable this would be, and if there is opposition from the African Union, and if there is strong opposition to military intervention in Niger, that might not be as palatable for the European Union.
Well, so given what you're saying here about financing and support, how likely is it, in your view, that we will see some kind of military intervention in Niger?
Essentially, with each day that passes, the military junta in Niger is gaining more and more of an upper hand. This diplomatic engagement with Chad is an interesting part of showing that they're doing business as usual. They're creating a fait accompli. So with each day that passes, it becomes possibly less likely. But equally, this meeting today in Accra in Ghana of military chiefs is going to be crunch time for ECOWAS. ECOWAS does not only have questions about regional stability to keep in mind, but also its own credibility. So we will hopefully know more by the end of these meetings in Ghana on how likely that is. But currently, the external circumstances are making this quite difficult for the bloc.
Well, let's say that there is a military intervention. What exactly would it look like? How would it play out in terms of troops and numbers?
I think a very interesting point here is that the word standby force has been a bit misleading, because I believe that has led other people to believe that there is kind of a ready army literally standing by that could be deployed at any point. But in fact, the individual ECOWAS members have to commit troops to this possible intervention force. So far, we have only had a firm commitment from Côte d'Ivoire. They said they would be able to commit about 1,000 troops, possibly a bit more, possibly a bit less. But we really need to wait to hear from Nigeria. Nigeria is by far the most powerful military power in the region, with about 130,000 active military personnel. But equally, the Nigerian military is already quite stretched. There is a lot of insecurity within the country, including due to jihadist threats. So how many troops will they actually be able to commit? Then we have to wait to hear from other ECOWAS members. Niger itself has about an active fighting force of around 30,000 troops. And if we're thinking about the last intervention where ECOWAS intervened militarily in the Gambia, they assembled a troop of around 7,000 to 8,000 people. And given how much larger Niger is than the Gambia, about 100 times larger, it seems unlikely that they would be looking to assemble a force that is smaller than those 7,000 people. But the question is still, where are they going to come from?
Well, so France and the U.S. both have troops in Niger. What are the chances that either of those countries would get involved in some kind of military action?
For both France and the US, this is quite a difficult situation. They had, especially France, had protests outside their military bases in the last few weeks. And there's probably a real focus on favoring diplomacy over at all getting involved militarily. They might be willing to defend their military bases if there were an attack on it. But otherwise, I believe there is a strong preference for letting ECOWAS handle this. They might be willing to lend some logistical, some operational support. But getting involved actively militarily would only further boost anti-Western and especially anti-French sentiment that's already been rife in Niger, and which is something that the junta has really tapped into to galvanize support for the coup.
Yeah, what about public support for some kind of intervention? As you say, we've seen protests in support of the coup leaders in Niger and resistance to any action by ECOWAS and some neighboring countries as well.
Again, the picture here has really shifted. In the first few days after the coup, there were some protests against the coup, but over the last 2 weeks, what we have seen, especially out of the capital, Niamey, is chiefly support for the coup, including this concert that you've shown some pictures on last Sunday, where they filled half a stadium with pro-coup supporters. And that is probably one of the most difficult things to handle. There is not universal support. We see a lot of support from Niamey, but equally we have seen a current politician and former rebel leader, Mr. Boula, who is a former Tuareg military leader who has formed a military group within, was trying to form a military, oppose the coup and oppose the current junta, but we haven't heard very much from that. And in addition to thinking about the support there is or support there isn't for military intervention in Niger, it's also interesting to think about the other ECOWAS countries. Nigeria, publicly, there is not a lot of support for Nigeria to become militarily involved in Niger, especially across the northern border, where there are often familial ties or ethnic ties that go across the Niger-Nigerian border, where there really isn't a lot of appetite for a military intervention, where people are expecting probably quite a high number of civilian casualties.
Okay, Isabelle Trick, Associate Director at the Global Counsel. Always enlightening to speak with you. Thanks so much for sharing your time and being with us here on France 24.